In May 1945, the Second World War in Europe had reached its conclusion. The Third Reich had collapsed, and peace was being restored. However, as soldiers and civilians on the victorious side were still intoxicated with triumph, they had no idea that in London, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, one of the top leaders of the European Allied forces, was contemplating an attack on the very nation with which he had once joined hands to crush Nazi Germany, an attack that could plunge the entire world back into the furnace of war once again. All of it was contained in a plan codenamed Operation Unthinkable. Three months before victory at the Yalta Conference, Churchill had already sensed Stalin's ambitions toward the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, especially Poland. As the war drew to its final days, Stalin showed an ever more unshakable determination. It even seemed that the Soviet leader was ready to abandon the agreements he had reached with Churchill and Roosevelt on the formation of a government in Poland. This enraged Churchill and led to a significant shift in his policy toward his former ally. In early May 1945, just a few days after the Red Army captured Berlin, Churchill ordered the chiefs of staff to draw up plans for Operation Unthinkable, a preemptive all-out attack on the Soviet Union to be waged on land, in the air, and at sea. According to Brigadier Jeffrey Thompson, a former officer of the Royal Artillery and the strategic architect of this plan, Unthinkable was conceived as a military offensive in which the Western Allied forces would drive deep into the territories occupied by the Soviet Union in order to impose the will of the United States and the British Empire on Moscow. The rise of Adolf Hitler did not begin with bullets. It began with promises poured straight into the desperate hearts of the German people. The Western Allied forces, including Britain, the United States, and Canada, would be divided into two main thrusts, advancing across the areas of Germany and Poland under Soviet control. The northern spearhead would strike along the axis from Stettin to Bydgoszcz and Danzig. The southern spearhead would set out from Leipzig, driving toward Breslau and Brno. However, this was certainly not going to be an easy mission, because in terms of force ratios, the Western Allies were at a severe disadvantage compared to their opponent. By the spring of 1945, the Soviet Union had around 170 combat-ready divisions, while Britain and the United States together could muster only 47. General Thompson calculated that defeating the Red Army would require additional manpower, and he put forward a fiercely controversial idea rearming Wehrmacht and SS units, which in his view would add roughly 10 battle-hardened divisions to the Western forces. Then came a meticulously organized anti-Jewish campaign. Jews were branded as parasites, expelled from their jobs, stripped of their property, and even forbidden to own radios or telephones. Alongside this was the effective use of naval superiority to seize the port of Stettin on the Baltic Sea at an early stage. Thompson also proposed halting exports to the Soviet Union of items such as explosives, rubber, aluminum, copper, and especially aviation fuel in order to cripple the Red Army's power. Although the plan had been drawn up with such astonishing detail, its strategic architect still warned Prime Minister Churchill that the Soviet armed forces were commanded by a highly capable and experienced high command, possessed the ability to sustain combat effectiveness beyond any Western army, and were ready to use bold tactics to achieve their objectives. This meant that if war was ignited with Moscow, the Western Allies would be staking everything on a gamble, with a very high chance of failure. For that reason, many senior British military commanders expressed doubt about General Thompson's plan. The Prime Minister's chief military advisor, General Hastings Ismay, was one of those people. His doubts even escalated into genuine horror when he read the proposal to rearm the Wehrmacht and the SS. When dawn broke, the machinery of repression was already waiting. At At the same time, Ismay reminded his colleagues that the government had spent the past 5 years telling the British public that the Russians had borne the brunt of the war and endured unimaginable suffering. Therefore, launching an attack on this former ally immediately after the war ended would be a public relations disaster and would negatively affect the morale of the troops. And from that moment on, the road to the Holocaust was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability gaining speed. On behalf of the Prime Minister's Chiefs of Staff, he affirmed that the chances of success were virtually non-existent. In the end, on 8 June 1945, Operation Unthinkable was officially rejected by Churchill and his military advisors. Yet even in that darkness, people clung to their last fragments of dignity, secret schools, clandestine prayers, tiny melodies that fought against despair. In the first scenario, we would witness a total war between the two sides. Within days of Operation Unthinkable getting the green light, the Allied Chiefs of Staff received orders to begin mobilizing troops and preparing assembly areas for the attack. As mentioned earlier, the surprise assault would be divided into 2 axes, and the primary objective of both would be to establish a solid defensive line stretching from Danzig to Brno before the winter months set in and slow down the Western war effort. On 1 July 1945, the attack order is issued. Allied armored and mechanized divisions begin to roll along the predetermined routes of advance. British and American fighters swarm the skies while the Baltic Sea is thick with Royal Navy warships. What had previously been unthinkable has now become reality. Europe has once again fallen into war. Yet no one can say with certainty what the final outcome will be. They moved from village to village, stripping people of their possessions, driving Jews out to open fields, forcing them to dig their own graves, and shooting them at point-blank range. After forcing the Soviet 65th Army to withdraw from Rostock, these units seized control of key bridges and roads, leading south towards Stettin. Elsewhere, U.S. forces overwhelm the Red Army at Leipzig, then push into Czechoslovak territory and force Soviet troops to fall back and dig in around the city of Prague. At Plzeň, units of the Soviet 33rd and 13th Armies struggle to defend what remains of the city under fierce assault from the U.S. First Army. Overall, Allied headquarters is in high spirits. However, the offensive momentum quickly fades as the Soviet forces, hardened by years of brutal fighting, hold their ground and fiercely resist across eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. It does not take long for the British and American armored divisions to realize that their advance has been blocked by the Red Army's dense artillery fire. Within just a few days, Red Army reinforcements flood into the front lines to stabilize the defenses and organize counterattacks. Despite the horrific losses they suffered in the Great Patriotic War, the Red Army is confident that its reserve forces, numbering in the millions, are more than sufficient to withstand the next waves of Western attacks. On the other side, the Allies are in no such position. Having just emerged from World War II with hundreds of thousands of casualties, they now plunge into another conflict in which tens of thousands of British, American, and Canadian soldiers are killed in just the first month. In this desperate situation, the Allied High Command is forced to adopt the proposal General Thompson had laid out in the original Operation Unthinkable plan, reconstituting and deploying German units against the Soviet Union. Accordingly, 10 German divisions are sent to the front in early August 1945. As the British generals had warned, however, forcing soldiers who had only recently been shooting at one another to now fight side by side breeds confusion and mutual distrust within the ranks, severely undermining combat effectiveness. By late August, the Red Army launches a series of large-scale coordinated offensives to exploit weaknesses along the Allied front. In the north, Soviet forces recapture Rostock, driving the British and Canadians back toward Hamburg. In the south, the situation for the Allies is no less grim as the U.S. 1st, 3rd, and 7th Armies are compelled to retreat. Riding the wave of these victories, Soviet troops retake Dresden and Leipzig, then push deeper into Allied-held territory, forcing American forces back to their staging areas in Bavaria. By the end of September, the war has sunk into a stalemate, with neither side able to secure a decisive victory. Now, the prolonged conflict only deepens the already crushing war weariness on both sides. At the railway platform where trains carrying Jews from all across Europe arrived, extermination unfolded like a cold mechanical assembly line. With a single glance from an SS doctor, a nod, or a flick of the hand, each person's fate was. On the other side, the Soviet Union also faces mounting strain as economic hardship and constant fighting erode its will to continue the war. As the cold snows of December begin to fall, leaders on both sides blanch at the thought of a winter campaign, something that would all but guarantee this conflict turning into a brutal war of attrition. Soon afterward, diplomatic channels are opened to enforce a ceasefire and bring an end to the ongoing violence. By this point, most of Central and Eastern Europe has been devastated. Economic crisis engulfs both the Soviet Union and the Western Allied nations, leading to severe food shortages and an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. Millions are driven from their homes, and the infrastructure lies in chaos. In the end, an armistice is signed in early 1946, establishing a new peace, with demilitarized zones springing up along the boundary between the Eastern and Western blocs, the line that will come to be known as the Iron Curtain. That is why the final stage of the Holocaust in 1944 became the fastest-moving storm of extermination in the entire war. Next, we come to the second scenario, in which the Soviet Union's defensive strength is sufficient to block any attacks on the territories it controls. Although by this point the Allies' ground forces have been weakened, they still attempt to focus on gaining air superiority. Accordingly, the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces coordinate to launch a massive bombing campaign, deploying between 2,000 and 3,000 bombers. The flying fortresses sweep across the skies over Soviet-occupied regions and strike at key military and industrial targets. On the other side, the Soviet Air Force is struggling to build an effective defensive system. A haunting question lingers. When a regime collapses, does it drag its crimes down with it, or does it try to leave as many corpses as possible before it disappears? At the same time, Moscow is also in trouble at sea, as both the Black Sea and the Baltic are blockaded by the Royal Navy, paralyzing Soviet naval operations and forcing the Red Army to rely solely on its ground forces, making it difficult to generate any major strategic breakthroughs. Alongside British dominance at sea, the Americans introduce a new trump card called the atomic weapon. On 16th of July 1945, the Trinity test under the Manhattan Project is carried out successfully, demonstrating the devastating destructive power of the nuclear bomb. After this event, U.S. President Harry S. Truman and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill agree to deploy this weapon to force the Soviet Union to surrender before Moscow can extend its neutrality pact with Japan to form an alliance against the Allies, or worse yet, develop a nuclear arsenal of its own. Clearly, this is an extraordinarily deathly difficult decision, but both leaders believe it will end the war quickly and prevent bloodshed in the future. By August, the United States is ready to use its first 2 atomic weapons. On the 11th, American B-29s dropped the first 15-kiloton atomic bomb on a concentration of Red Army forces stationed in a major industrial city in Central Europe. 4 days later, the second bomb, with a yield of about 20 kilotons, detonates at one of the Soviet Union's most strategically important warm water ports on the Black Sea. Although Moscow has learned of America's nuclear potential through espionage, the catastrophic and immediate impact of the atomic strikes still lies beyond anything they had imagined. Faced with unprecedented devastation and staggering casualties, and with the clear danger of a nuclear massacre, that they themselves are unable to retaliate against the Soviet leadership, is forced to capitulate at the negotiating table. A ceasefire order is issued. Millions more were pulled into the gears of annihilation: the Roma homosexuals, the disabled Soviet POWs, and anyone the regime labeled as unfit to live. The Holocaust was not a massacre. It was a project to eradicate the very foundation of Europe's humanity. Likewise, Poland voices concern about the power of nuclear weapons and the immeasurable consequences they bring. The industrial cities and port facilities that were bombed suffer enormous loss of life and catastrophic damage to infrastructure, triggering a humanitarian crisis that demands robust intervention from the international community. From this point on, the global balance of power shifts dramatically. The United States and its Western allies gain significant influence in Eastern Europe and Asia, reshaping the geopolitical landscape of the world. After its defeat, the Soviet Union will certainly seek to develop and expand its own nuclear arsenal, marking the beginning of an extremely tense Cold War. The world enters a new and more dangerous era where the threat of nuclear conflict is ever present, and the arms race escalates with a sense of urgency never seen before. To close this video, we come to a final scenario in which the Western allies are overwhelmed by the red tide. Although the United States has made significant progress on the Pacific Front against the Japanese Empire, its decision to divert large amounts of resources to that theater severely limits its ability to support military operations in Europe. Death camps like Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, or Dachau no longer resound with screams or the smoke of crematoria, yet the silence there weighs heavier than any cry. Alongside this, the spy ring known as the Cambridge Five, recruited by the Soviet secret police NKVD, has penetrated deep into the British intelligence apparatus and obtained critical information. Thanks to this, Moscow learns of the attack plan before the Allies launch their surprise ground offensive on 1st July. Facing a Red Army on high alert and already prepared in advance, both Allied thrusts, the Northern and the Southern, struggle on the battlefield, repeatedly being pushed back even before they can capture any strategic positions. This quickly turns Western hopes of a lightning victory into smoke. Meanwhile, despite sanctions, naval blockades, and devastating bombing raids, the Soviet High Command remains confident as the Red Army continues to advance across Central Europe. This forces the Allied commanders in a state of desperation to order a strategic withdrawal to defensive positions in West Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. Now, with morale having collapsed badly by the end of July, the relentless pressure of Soviet attacks has driven British and American forces back to the western bank of the Elbe. Confronted with this dire situation, Allied strategists begin to consider the use of nuclear weapons. However, with two wars raging simultaneously, one against Japan and one against the Soviet Union, many predict that any nuclear action will trigger a corresponding need for retaliatory measures in order to guard against the worst possible scenarios. Therefore, President Truman decides not to deploy atomic bombs in Europe, but to hold them back as a final strategic card. This means the Allies must continue fighting with conventional means, and casualties will inevitably keep rising. On the diplomatic front, Japan and the Soviet Union extend their non-aggression pact at the end of August and declare that they will jointly resist Western aggression. With its eastern border now secured, Moscow can redeploy a large number of troops from the Far East to reinforce the European front. At the same time, Japanese forces in Manchuria focus on maintaining control over the territories they occupy, making Allied plans in the Pacific even more complicated. Moving into September and October, the Allies suffer increasingly heavy losses while their fighting spirit erodes under the constant bombardment and shelling unleashed by Marshal Georgy Zhukov's divisions. By November, the Red Army is advancing like a storm, forcing Allied forces to retreat deep into the west. As winter begins, Soviet troops have driven American forces completely out of Austrian territory, just as they are trying to regroup with Allied units in northern Italy. In West Germany, the Red Army halts its advance at the Rhine, concerned about direct intervention by other Western nations, while its supply lines begin to stretch thin due to the harsh winter and the fact that the front is now far from Soviet borders. Looking back at all three scenarios, one chilling common thread emerges no matter how it begins. Operation Unthinkable would almost certainly end in catastrophe. Not just in terms of unimaginable casualty figures, but in a Europe torn apart for the third time in the first half of the 20th century, in exhausted economies, in a political map of the world, warped in chaos. At that point, the question would no longer be who wins, who loses, but what would even be left to call a victory. That is why the decision by the British leadership to set Unthinkable aside was not just a strategic calculation, but almost a moral verdict. They chose to stay their hand. And thanks to that, a peace, fragile but sufficient for Europe to rebuild, was preserved, opening the way for a Cold War that was tense, but far less drenched in blood.